Surely you've had a Chianti at some point in your life, maybe even this week. Have you ever wondered about what makes a Chianti different from a Chianti Classico, or why you should choose a Chianti Classico Riserva? Did you even know there was another Chianti called Gran Selezione? Today you'll hear a conversation with Giovanni Folonari, whose family has been making wine in Tuscany for over 100 years. So he's kind of an expert on the subject. He'll explain all these different Chianti wines to help you choose the right one, and he'll help you understand Super Tuscans. This is the Inside Wine Podcast. I'm Joe Janish, a wine industry professional since 1996, giving you insider tips to make the right wine decisions. Let's get right into our conversation with Giovanni Folonari. Today we're here with Giovanni Folonari, who is a winemaker in Tuscany, and his family's been in Tuscany for how many years has your family been in Tuscany, Giovanni?
Well, my great-grandfather bought Ruffino in 1913. So Ruffino is based in Pontassieve, so I would say that around the beginning of last century, yeah.
Oh, wow. Okay. So you have a little bit of a background in Tuscany and the wines that are made there, I would say, 100 years.
Yeah.
And more recently...
100 years, yeah.
Yeah. And more recently, you and your father started your own smaller winemaking business in Tuscany. So tell us a little bit about when that happened and what the goals were of you and your father when you started this newer venture.
Well, okay, so going back to the history, there's a lot of good things about a family business, but there are a few things that are tough. Well, one of them is the number of family members that grows every generation. So that forces us to go through family divisions. So one of them happened in 2000, which is 20 years ago, where we decided, me and my father, to concentrate more on the estate bottled wines. At the time, we had both, but most of our business was in big numbers, volumes, and cellar more than vineyard. So now the idea was to get into something smaller, just the two of us, and own vineyards to make our own grapes, to grow our own grapes, to make our own wines with those grapes in all the most strategic areas of Tuscany. As you know, Tuscany is a great and famous wine producing area, one of the most famous in Italy. The nice thing about Tuscany is that this region allows us to make all sorts of different wines with domestic varietals, indigenous varietals, as well as with international. But even the wines made with international varieties do have a strong identity coming from the region, which is what we want. So our idea was to have land in the most interesting areas. So for that reason, besides our most important vineyard, which is Nozzole, which is right in the middle of the Chianti Classico, that's between Florence and Siena, we also have, and the Super Tuscans with Cabreo, that is also in the Chianti Classico area. The vineyards are in Greve Chianti. We have a property with vineyards and a cellar in Montalcino called La Fuga, where we make Brunello. We have vineyards in Bolgheri, where we make our Campo al Mare, which is our Bolgheri DOC wine. And we have vineyards in Maremma. So overall, there is 5 different, I call them estates. That means it's a property that has land with vineyards and a cellar and a house or a villa, whatever. So the whole thing all together. So our idea was to offer to the consumer a good idea of the potential of Tuscany with the wines. So we have the most important appellations, traditional appellations like Chianti Classico, like Brunello. We have the Super Tuscans. We have the important modern appellations like Bolgheri. So we think we have it all. Well, we hope. So that is the idea of our new project that started in 2000 after the family division.
Okay, so in the United States, not everyone has a really good grasp of the differences in Tuscany, and I think because Americans are they learn more about California wine first, and they think about varietals first, and Cabernet, Merlot, Chardonnay. They don't understand as much the regions and the differences in the region. And I can tell you there are many Americans who think that Chianti is a varietal. It's a grape. So what I'd like to do is kind of start out with you explaining to the listener, just in case they're not aware, what could be the difference between Chianti, Chianti Classico, a Chianti Classico Riserva, and now we have this new thing called Gran Selezione. I think it was created just to confuse Americans even more. So maybe...
No, the whole world.
So maybe you could start out by explaining what is Chianti and why someone might want Chianti Classico versus Chianti versus a Riserva or a Gran Selezione.
Well, before I do that, I would like to say something about the Americans and their knowledge on Italian wines.
Sure.
I mean, I don't want to blame this on them that they don't recognize Chianti as an appellation, but more as a varietal. I mean, it does make sense, the fact that if you classify wines by varietal, it's a lot easier. Okay?
Yes, correct.
But then again, you need to have a geographical area. I mean, Napa Valley, Sonoma, it's an example, and those are geographical areas within California, which has many of them. Because obviously a Cabernet coming from Napa is different from a Cabernet that comes from Southern California,
Right.
Anyway,
That's a good point.
In Italy, unfortunately, it's complicated because all the appellations, as you were mentioning, are geographical. So in a region like Tuscany, which is a portion of Italy, I would say center-west of Italy, with its capital is Florence, we do have a lot of vineyards planted and a lot of wines produced. Now, the most famous appellations are Chianti and Chianti Classico. They are famous because the volume, the size, the production, and the years that have been produced are so, they helped to let this name known worldwide. I think Chianti, the word Chianti referred to a wine, is probably the most worldwide known wine.
Yeah, it could be.
It's Chianti. Everybody knows what Chianti is.
Yes.
Now, not many people know the difference, which is important to know. Again, I was mentioning you that all these areas, that includes Montalcino, that includes Bolgheri, along with the Chianti and Chianti Classico, are geographical. That means there is a geographical limit within you can plant vineyards and have them eventually registered in the appellation registry, because all the vineyards are a closed number. That means if I have a piece of land in Grevin Chianti, which is right in the middle of the Chianti Classico area, I cannot wake up in the morning and plant a vineyard. I cannot do that. They will arrest me because the number of total acreage of vineyards in Italy is a closed number as a European Community law. So we cannot increase that number. Also, most always within the appellation, it's also a closed number. Let me explain. A few years ago, to increase some of these geographical appellations and therefore create more visibility for them, some of these were allowed to increase in number of vineyards registered. The example is Bolgheri. Bolgheri 25, 30 years ago was only 200 hectares. 1 hectare is 2.2 acres, by the way. Registered. Now we are over 1,000. So for a period of time, they open up. That meant if you had land inside that area, you could buy the permission of planting from somebody else, somewhere else in Italy, that were pulling out a vineyard and not replanting it anymore. Take it over and transform it into Bolgheri DOC. Now, obviously, this is closed as along with the Chianti Classico, with the Brunello, of course. That means that if I want to plant, increase my acreage in the Chianti Classico, I need to find somebody in the Chianti Classico that has Chianti Classico registered vineyards that will pull them out and not replant them, and he will sell me, because those are expensive, the papers, the permission for planting. So it's quite a long procedure, a lot of bureaucracy, very strict. But this is good because maintains the number closed. Okay. Now, having said that, Chianti is a much wider area than Chianti Classico. Why it's called Chianti Classico? Classico means classic. And that is because that area of the Classico, which is only one small portion of the whole Chianti area, is the area where it all started. And that is the area between Florence and Siena. Just to give you an idea, the total number of hectares, so multiply 2.2 to get the acres, of registered Chianti Classico vineyards is 6,800 hectares, something around there. We personally, Folonari with Nozzole, we own 100 hectares, okay, out of these. That's a close number. So Chianti, it's a much wider area, goes all the way from Florence, from east of Florence, all the way to Pisa, which is almost near the sea. So it's almost the entire heart of Tuscany, and the total number of registered vineyards, it's around 20,000 hectares. So it's a much wider area. And unfortunately, for us, I'm saying for us, Chianti Classico, and for the image of us, the Chianti, most of the production in the Chianti, with a few exceptions, especially in the Rufina area, is more for quantity rather than quality. So the prices are very different. The structure of the wine is different. The aging potential is different. In most cases, Chianti, it's usually more of an everyday, cheaper wine. Okay? That is the reason why sometimes people don't understand why they see on a shelf a Chianti that sells for $6 and a Chianti that sells for $60. Okay, the major difference is this. The Classico appellation, it's a much smaller area. I like to call it the heart of the Chianti, okay? And that is the area that has the concentration, the highest concentration of the high-end Chianti wines. So Chianti Classico is always more of a fine wine, and Chianti, with few exceptions, is always an everyday wine. Okay. Having said that, if we go inside the Chianti Classico appellation, we have three different levels of wine. We have the vintage, which is the everyday wine, the young Chianti Classico, okay, that can be released a little over a year after the harvest. You have a minimum of aging required. You don't have bottle aging required. Obviously, these are wines that are younger, that are meant to be drank sooner, easier, lighter, everything. Then we have the Riserva, okay, that until 7 years ago was the top of the line, the top end of the Chianti Classico. So to be called Riserva, the wine needs to age 2 years. You need to sell it not earlier than 2 years counting from January 1st after the vintage. And among the aging in oak, you also need a minimum of 2 months of bottle aging before you can release the wine to the public. So obviously, a winery that makes both will keep the best lots coming from the older vineyards, the best sun exposure. Once you vinify the wines, you select which are the best vats, and you make the cuvée obviously it's going to be a much more concentrated cuvée, and that you can say, okay, this is good enough to be Riserva, so we will age it longer, we will keep it longer, and we will release it as Riserva. In some cases, there are vineyards inside the property that are particularly good for quality because of many variables, the exposure, the age of the vines, and so forth. And so they usually tend to give you the best juice. And in those cases, you can even make the so-called single vineyard. So when you see on a bottle Riserva Vigneto Il Pozzo, means that that particular vineyard is registered only to make the Riserva, and you make the Riserva out of that particular vineyard. Of course, you cannot use others. If you put Vigneto on the label, it has to come from that vineyard of yours. Now, this Riserva used to be the high end of the Chianti Classico, okay? Recently, the consortium introduced another appellation which goes right above Riserva, which is called Gran Selezione. Now, the differences between Riserva and Gran Selezione are 30 months minimum aging instead of 24. The juice has to come entirely from your vineyards. Even if you buy 1% of that juice going into those bottles, you cannot call that Gran Selezione. So Gran Selezione has to be 100% estate grown, okay? And then the third parameter is the sensory evaluation. You know that for the DOCG, you don't only need to have chemical analysis to see if the wine is okay, correct, and everything, and all the papers that show the origin, the vineyards, and so forth. But you also have a sensory evaluation, a blind tasting done by the consortium, where they taste your wine and decide if it's good enough or not to be called such. Okay. In that case, if you get the promotion, or however you want to call it, they will give you that slip that you put, that sticker that you put on the bottle, on the neck of the bottle. Now, the parameters used for the Gran Selezione are a lot more severe. Just to give you an idea, in 2013, when we first came out with it, 72, I think, wineries sent wines to be called Gran Selezione. Only 36, exactly half of them passed. The others failed. So the reason why all these very severe parameters have been put in the Gran Selezione is because the dream of the consortium was in the future to hopefully have people remember that name as quality. You know, the only appellation that tells everybody it's a high-end wine as today in Tuscany is Brunello. Now, we don't have that in Chianti Classico, and on the other hand, like I was mentioning before, we have this very tough situation with Chianti, which does exactly the opposite. Partially ruins the image of the high-end wines. So we really wanted to have something special where only the very good wines could get in, and hopefully people in the future, by drinking these wines, will remember this. Okay. The other reason why we have such strict rules is because we wanted to keep out the commercial bottlers, those that buy bulk wine and bottle and sell millions of bottles for cheap wines, which are also present in the Classico area. So we wanted to have only the growers, only the viticulturists be able to make these type of wines. Now, the idea was good, but the effect was not so good because we were not able to explain clearly and correctly this concept to the consumer. And the other mistake that was done by us producers was to get a wine that was already existing in our portfolio and just change it into Gran Selezione. That was a terrible mistake because the consumer that is used to drink that wine of yours, and maybe they drank it for the past 20 years and the wine is a Riserva, and all of a sudden the same wine, because it's good enough to be called such, it goes through the exams and everything, and it sells like Gran Selezione, people don't like that because they say, wait a minute, I mean, I know your wine, this wine I've been drinking for 20 years. It's the same wine, it was good before, it's good now, but now it's not a Riserva anymore, it's a Gran Selezione, and it costs $6, $10 more. So to me, I think you're trying to take advantage of the situation to make me pay more money for the same wine. So this was a terrible mistake that created a lot of confusion that most of the wineries did. We didn't do it because we were really sensitive about this matter, and for that reason, we created a wine, the Gran Selezione Giovanni Folonari, which has my signature on it, which didn't exist before. So we created a wine specifically for the new appellation.
Okay. So this is a very unusual and interesting process for a wine to be created, especially to Americans. I can't think of any kind of wine in America that would be peer reviewed like this. Is this a common thing in Italy to have this review system before wine can be called something like a Gran Selezione?
Well, it has been common since the introduction of the DOCG appellation, which is also in France. It's not only, it's like the AOC in France. So we wanted to have something that could control much better the quality, not only technically, but also from a tasting point of view. So not only the specs and the rules and the appellation and the papers should be correct, but also the taste of the wine. And for that reason, we wanted to really focus on the quality and on the uniformity. And that is the reason why I think it was maybe 40 years ago when we started the OCG. So it is something more strict, more complicated for us producers, but allows to have a better and more uniform quality whatsoever. And so it's a very good tool for the consumer, I would say.
To actually have to have your wine pass through a tasting panel before it can be labeled something, I don't know. I just never thought that was something that could happen. That's an amazing kind of thing. And you said about 70 or so wines went through this process and only about half of them made it through to Gran Selezione, right?
Well, now obviously the tasting panel has certain parameters.
Yeah.
So the parameters that they use to taste a young Chianti Classico are different from the ones for a Riserva and from the ones for a Gran Selezione. So in a Chianti Classico vintage young wine, you expect to have a good balance, not strange, weird notes, oxidized or gamey excessively. The wine needs to be a good, pleasant wine.
Right.
Now, obviously, for the Riserva and even more the Gran Selezione, you need to have many other parameters that have to match perfectly. The wine needs to have a structure, needs to have a complexity, basically needs to be really good. If it's not good enough, it's not going to pass.
Okay.
And that makes sense because in the short term, you could, attract people because it's something new, something from Italy, from an interesting region. But if the quality is not there, people will not buy the bottle again. And that's not what we want. We want to think long term more than short term.
Sure.
So I think this is very useful, especially in Italy where people often try to, to find shortcuts. If you see what I'm saying.
Sure. Yeah.
So this is really good. And although it's a little bit of a hassle, but I totally agree with this concept.
Okay. Now, will Gran Selezione be made in every vintage, and I know we've had one or two challenging vintages in the last 10 years. No.
Well, that's a company policy. There are companies that made the top Bulgari super expensive wines in vintages like 2002. And then maybe they go around and they say, whoa, this is our cru. We only make it in the best vintage. Now, our crus are not only the Brunello Riserva, that we make only 6,000 bottles once in a while, or our Bolgheri Superiore, where we make very few bottles of, but our crus are also the mid-high quality wines. So starting from the Riserva, Chianti Classico, all the way to the Super Tuscans, and of course the Gran Selezione, we only make in the years where it's worth making. That means the Gran Selezione, we didn't make the 2014 vintage, we skipped. We skipped that on Cabreo, we skipped that on many other wines. So there are vintages where we don't make the wine, but there are also vintages where we don't make the Riserva either, which is a little bit below the Gran Selezione. We think this is very important for the image of our winery. people like to hear that with words saying, "Oh, this I only make this wine in the best vintage," but they like to see that too. They don't like to hear it, and then every single vintage you make the wine. I mean, it doesn't make sense.
This actually brings me into another subject for you that you can kind of explain to me. So when you have the Chianti Classico Riserva, the Gran Selezione, all different styles, different levels, maybe you could help the listener understand. So you explained Chianti would be like an everyday wine that you would drink with whatever, slice of pizza maybe. What kind of food pairings would you do for Chianti Classico Riserva and Gran Selezione? Would it be the same types of foods, or would you try to have different types of foods with those different types of wines?
Well, I have my theory on the food pairing, which sometimes can be too complicated for people to follow. I go on some very basic, simple rules. Of course, the most important rule is what you like,
right?
Not what people tell you to do.
Right.
Okay. It is something that you need to be happy with. But usually the rule is wines that have a good acidity and a good balance are much easier to pair with any type of food other than wines that are very concentrated with soft tannins and a soft, sweety finish. So considering that our wines are more of the first kind, even Bolgheri, which is the most modern style wine we have, they do have a sustained acidity, which makes it much easier to pair with any type of food. Obviously, the other rule, very important, that I like to see in the wine pairing is the more tasty is the food, the more tasty you need to have the wine. Otherwise, one will kill the other. So you need to pair those up. Obviously, a Chianti with a pizza sounds good, just like a nice plate of pasta or meat with the Chianti Classico. And then if you want to use a Riserva or even a Brunello di Montalcino, then you go in some more tasty meat like stoved wild boar or meat with special sauces. So the tastier the food, the stronger the wine to combine and to balance with the two together.
Like that.
That's what I usually like to do.
That's a good way to help people kind of guide them, because I agree with you. It's whatever you like, but people do need like a little bit of guidance to get them started. And I think that's a really good way to put it.
Oh yeah. The best guidance is try to find wines with a good acidity that you might think they're not as pleasant as the soft tannin, sweet, juicy wines, but they're definitely much better with food. Second thing is base the strength and the concentration of the wine on the taste of the food. Try to balance those two together.
Okay. Thank you. So you spoke a little bit about Bolgheri and Super Tuscans. Let's talk a little bit about Super Tuscans. People don't truly understand that either. That's another confusing term for people. And part of that, I think, is because there really isn't any requirements or regulations in the same way there are for, a Brunello or a Chianti Classico Riserva or something like that. So
exactly.
Maybe you could kind of walk us through that.
Okay, this was something that started the phenomena started with one or two exceptions in the early 70s, and then until the late 80s, there were few producers, not many, that were making such wines, the pioneers. Then in the 90s, this phenomena exploded. Why did it start? Well, first of all, it all started with very few exceptions, one of which outside of the area in Bolgheri, I'm talking about Sassicaia, of course, it all started in the Chianti Classico area. Okay. Why? Because at the time, in those years, to produce Chianti Classico, we were forced by law to use at least 20% of white varieties in the blend and 2 red varieties, Sangiovese and Canaiolo. This didn't help in those small quantities that people wanted to make as high-end wines. As we were saying before, most of the wines were drank young at the time and cheap and easygoing. So, but some wines, were on the high end, and it was impossible to make a high end wine using 20% white varieties.
Right. Yeah.
For a red wine. So for these reasons, we asked several times the consortium to try and change the rules. I was mentioning you before that my family has always been in the changes and looking at what the consumer wanted and be willing to, to put yourself into discussion and say, well, maybe I'm doing something wrong, I should change. Well, the consortium didn't want to do that because they were insisting with the fact that they are locked with, traditions that have been going on for centuries. And at the question we were asking ourselves, saying, well, what type of tradition we're talking about? The fiasco? I mean, wines that very often people were buying because they wanted to keep the container to put a candle in it. Anyway, they did not want to change. So as a result, we had to do something different. We wanted to use the Sangiovese, which was the only variety among the four that had potential to make these high-end wines. We wanted to use that alone, or have the possibility of using that alone, or using it in blends with good high-end international red varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon especially, but also Cabernet Franc or Merlot. So in order to do that, we could not fall into the Chianti Classico appellation, even if our vineyards were engraving Chianti. It had to be called table wine. Now, table wine, as you probably know, is the cheapest and broadest and lower quality appellation designation that we have in Italy, but even in Europe. So it's a category among which there is all the jug wines with no vintage, no origin. Well, it has to be made in Italy, but it can come from any region. You don't have to specify much. And the wines are, very weak in all sorts of ways. Okay? So it was very confusing for the consumer, even more than Chianti and Chianti Classico now, having a wine with a very, very cheap appellation as table wine. In that category, you could find the jugs for 99 cents a bottle, and you could find the super high end, expensive red wine. So that was very confusing. And at the time, we didn't have a geographical regional appellation like we do now, because that started in 1993, the IGT that we're talking about. So we didn't even have a region of origin. So for that reason, some journalist, I think from England, tasting some of these wines, was disappointed and said, how can a good wine, complex wine like this be called just a simple table wine? This sounds more like super Tuscan. So the appellation came, the nickname came. Of course, we cannot use it because by law in Italy, you cannot use anything that says super, better, or anything like that written on the label, but we started using it as a nickname. Now, the advantage of the so-called Super Tuscans was that they could be produced anywhere in Tuscany, anywhere you had land. So there were no restrictions in terms of land, in terms of varietal, in terms of all sorts of things. And their idea was, let's give the freedom to the producer so they can try and do their best to make the best possible wine in that particular area. In theory, this is very good, but in practice, it's very confusing because the areas are so different, the varietals, the blends are so different that these wines end up being very different from each other. And then, of course, among these, there are people that try to take advantage of the image to make cheap wines because, of course, there is not such a strict rules or control like there is in the DOCGs. So what happened was in the 90s, it's true that the IGT appellation came out and that gave us an identity much better than the table wine. That means it has to come from a region and has a vintage and so forth. But the people started making Super Tuscan. They became hundreds. And these wines, invaded the whole trade, and they created a lot of confusion because there were different styles, different price points, different structure, everything. So it became very confusing. Now, the word Super Tuscan can mean anything. So people don't have an exact idea of the type of wine it is because of the reasons I told you, unlike Montalcino with Brunello, of course. So for that reason, what is important is the brand more than the appellation. So you have to look at the brand. I know it's a lot more complicated to look at the brand because there is so many brands, but if you have the advantage of being around in that particular appellation for many years, probably, hopefully, people will remember your brand. Of course, Sassicaia is an example, Tignanello is an example. Cabreo is not as much, but again, with Cabreo, we started in 1982, so it has been around a long time. We were some of the creators of this new appellation. Obviously, now the things have changed. After many years, the consortium of Chianti Classico changed the rules. Now you can make a Chianti Classico entirely with Sangiovese. You can use up to 20% international varieties, but 30 years later, it's a little too late.
Right.
So many producers that already have a name under the IGT appellation, they don't feel the need of changing that, unfortunately. So it is a shame, and this is the other reason that I didn't mention before why we came out with the Gran Selezione. It is a shame that in a Chianti Classico region, very often the best wines out of that region are not the OCG, but they are IGT, these Super Tuscans. So that is a little bit of the history. Of course, some of these wines became appellation, like Sassicaia, for example, because finally the consortium of Bolgheri, DOC, was a little smarter, more open-minded than the Chianti Classico. So immediately they saw a wine at that level, that quality level, not being able to be in their appellation because it didn't have 70% Sangiovese in the blend. That was one of the requirements. And it was a total paradox because they were famous for rosé jug wines, and in their area they have one of the best wines produced in Italy and in the world. So they said, well, maybe it would be convenient for us to change our appellation so they can come in. And that's what happened several years ago. Okay, but this didn't happen much in the Chianti Classico because they were a little too late.
Right. So you mentioned a few times Bolgheri and some other areas in Tuscany. So for someone who's trying to just get into Super Tuscans, the really high quality ones, if they're not familiar with too many brands, are there specific regions within Tuscany that in your mind are where they should start looking? Like you mentioned Bolgheri, is that a good place for someone to start?
Well, Bolgheri, people call them generically Super Tuscans, but they should be called Bolgheri DOC.
Okay.
But to all the effects are modern wines, and they're a lot more similar to the Super Tuscans in general. So for people that have a new approach and therefore they're not used to drink wine, they don't know much about wines, and sometimes they have a hard time with the tannins or the acidity of our traditional Brunellos or Chianti Classico Riservas unless they have some food with them. My suggestion is the Super Tuscans in the Chianti Classico area, definitely, and the Bolgheri in general as an appellation. Bolgheri DOC wines are great wines because they're modern. They do have an identity. They do have an acidity and balance, but they are more modern and easier to understand by people that are just wine lovers and they're not wine experts.
Okay. And Bolgheri is a little closer to the coast as opposed to some other areas of Tuscany. Is that what makes it a little different?
No, that is practically on the coast.
Okay.
So the border towards the coast is the old Aurelia Road, which is about from 3 to 5 kilometers from the shore. And so it goes towards the mountains, but on the hills you can see the sea. So it's the influence of the sea is very strong. That iodine that you often find in the taste of the wine, it comes from the influence of the sea, definitely.
Okay. And you make a wine there?
Yes, our winery, our estate or vineyard, it's called Campo al Mare. It means land by the sea. Campo, it means field, and mare means sea.
Okay. So tell us a little bit about that wine. What is it made of? What are the varietals?
Well, that was a project that we started right after our family division. We had bought the land shortly before. Me and my father planted the vineyards. We took advantage of that open appellation that I was mentioning you before. We bought most of our papers for planting from Veneto and from Sicily, believe it or not, took them over, transferred them into the Bolgheri area, and now we have 30 hectares of Bolgheri DOC planted vineyards. We love our Sangiovese. We try to use it everywhere we can, but in Bolgheri, because of the influence of the sea, the milder climate, Sangiovese doesn't give its best results. The best results are achieved with especially Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, and Merlot. Also Syrah, but mostly these first three. So we arrived there among the last, so we paid more for the land, but the advantage was we could see what others did. And so we didn't make the mistake of planting varieties that wouldn't give their best results over there. So mostly we have planted, it's Merlot, Cabernet Franc, and Cabernet Sauvignon. We have 1.5 hectares of Petit Verdot. And that's it. Then, of course, we have 5 hectares adding to those 30 of Vermentino, which is another white variety, very Italian, originated from Sardinia. It came down to the Liguria and the Tuscan coast, that has this very interesting character that identifies it, and it's very Italian. So it's grown quite successfully over there.
And so your Campo al Mare, how would that compare or contrast to your Cabreo, which is made from more inland? Why would a consumer pick up one or the other if they can only pick one?
Well, first of all, the Campo al Mare, I need to compare it with the Cabreo. We need to compare it with the Baia al Vento, which is our Bolgheri Superiore. It would be like a reserve for the Chianti Classico, okay? Because our Campo al Mare, it's a more of a young everyday wine. It's more like the Chianti Classico vintage.
Okay.
Now, the big difference is, first of all, the Cabreo has a good portion of Sangiovese, which makes it obviously different, especially in the tannins, especially in the finish. But mostly the difference is that the Campo al Mare, the Bolgheri, it's a thicker, a richer wine, a little more international, a little more new world in terms of the taste and the thickness and the concentration in the nose and the palate. But unlike the New World, it does have the acidity, so it's not a fruit bomb, it's not a jammy, chewy wine, because it has that acidity. So it's a nice compromise because it does have the elegance and the balance similar to the inland, older style wines like Cabreo, but it does have softer tannins. It's an easier wine, easier to approach it, and more modern in the style and the taste. So you get more the fruit, you get more the spice, rather than that earthy, leathery tobacco and sometimes slightly gamey taste that you get out of our traditional inland, if you want to call them like that, wines.
And are these wines that people will want to open up as soon as they buy them, or are they the type that you want to lay down in the cellar for a few years?
Well, usually Bolgheri has this big advantage that being wines a little softer in the tannins, modern in the style, they can be drank sooner. Wine that has a very high acidity, despite the concentration or the color or whatever, and has tough tannins, is a wine that requires long aging. And of course, our extreme is Brunello di Montalcino. Among the varietals, definitely Sangiovese, although sometimes it might look like it's not as concentrated in terms of thickness and tannins as Cabernet Sauvignon. People might think that the Cabernet needs more aging, but it's not true. It's the exact opposite. Sangiovese needs a lot more refining and aging in order to make it smoother and easier to drink. That's one of the reasons why in Montalcino you need to wait 5 years before you can release a vintage.
Okay. All right. This has been a really good discussion on Tuscany and Super Tuscans and all of this. Tell me, just to wrap up, what do you see happening in Tuscany? Is there going to be another thing like Super Tuscans or Gran Seleziones coming anytime soon? What are you seeing for the future of Tuscany, especially for the American consumer?
Well, I see that not really anything new, but a much better management of the vineyards to get a better fruit. And by better, I mean uniformly matured and healthy, in order to make more and more consistent vintages and more complex and elegant wines. Now, we need to do that because of the competition, and we need to do that because the climate is not helping us that much, because we have very hot summers, so we need to prevent the integrity of the grapes, the acidity levels, not having excessive sugar, all things that are caused by a very hot climate like we're having lately. We need to try and operate in order to withstand the health issues like, heavy storms or hail or frost, which are happening every now and then. So all our research is to try and find a better way to manage the vineyards, which is what really goes on as an investment and as a research, because the winemaking, it's quite simple and straightforward. And today we have very, techniques that have been tuned up for years. So we're pretty much set. The only problem with the winemaking is you need to do everything in order to prevent the integrity of the grapes. You can only ruin the wines, you cannot make them better in the cellar. So all the equipment has to be very, very gentle. What we are doing as a development there is trying to do a lot of sorting of the grapes, even in good vintages. So not only we do sorting in the vineyard, we do sorting in the cellar, and we have some optical machines which work really well, or also by hand. So the preservation of the primer material, it's the most important thing. And in our case, is the grapes.
Okay. And we're recording this in June of 2020. So it's going to be a little early to get a gauge on what the 2020 vintage will be like. But how would you say the 2019s and 2018s will be?
We were lucky. We had very good vintages, honestly. Even the 17, that was a small vintage because of the heat. We managed to drop a lot of green grapes, doing a massive green harvest. So we dropped our production by about 50%, 52%.
Oh boy.
And we were able to pick earlier and preserve the acidity. So I would say that the weaker vintage we had in the past few years was the 2014. Having a good management in other vintages that are difficult, like 17, partially 18, if you have a good management, you are able to have a great vintage. So this is also one of our main goals, to try and keep the very bad vintages rare, hopefully.
Yeah, there's only so much you can control, right?
No, of course. I mean, we're dealing with Mother Nature. We are not inside a factory, and we don't grow the grapes under, artificial light. And so It's complicated.
Well, it sounds like a wine drinker is in a good place right now with Italian wine, with Tuscan wine.
Oh, really good. Yeah. 17, the good guys made a difference. Otherwise, you might end up having wines with green tannins and low acidity, like it happened in 2003.
Right.
Okay, so the good producers are the ones that are able to have a consistent quality throughout all these vintages. Of course, the cost for us was more than twice the money to maintain that quality in 17 because the production was so low.
Okay.
I would say good producers, you will not find bad surprises in all of these vintages except for 2014.
Right.
Which was good for whites in Tuscany. Of course, Tuscany is not a famous white wine region, but those few that make whites, like our Cabrera La Pietra, for example, turned out really good in 2014. But the reds, are wines that need to be drank young. Other than that, all the other vintages, thank God, were good. And this year so far, it's a little problematic because of the weather, because it keeps raining and sun. So we need to monitor the health of the grapes closely. So it's a little more labor than usual. But so far, it looks good. So we keep our fingers crossed.
Exactly. Fingers crossed. We'll have yet another great vintage from Tuscany. Great.
Exactly.
Super. Giovanni, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Joe.
Thanks so much for listening to my conversation with Giovanni Folonari. I hope it helped you wrap your head around Chianti and Super Tuscans. And if it did, tell a friend about the show. Details on all the wines we talked about today are in the show notes. You can also go to insidewinepodcast.com for more information. Please be sure to subscribe so you can hear the next episode automatically. And in the meantime, remember, wine is food. It comes from a place. Enjoy it responsibly.